And we said, you know what? Single story may not be the issue. If we can get over this hump about whether it's single story or not, this may not be the issue. And so you look at something that's a little bit more conventionally zoned, and you take that very same building and push it to the road edge, and you have the pedestrian amenities that are already being asked for in the current zoning, you see, well, maybe it's single story is not the issue. It's about design and setback and the relative scale of a particular building. And when you see it side by side, you can really see the difference. And as we use these visuals as an example, I think we heard in the community, we heard certainly at the town board level, that we all sort of agreed. We said, right, okay, maybe it isn't just single story and two story. Maybe there's some more nuance to these issues. And so once we got over that hump, we were able to start exploring a number of different options. And I'm just going to summarize briefly what the key elements of the proposed zoning are. So first and foremost, allow for single-story buildings, but with limits. And we'll talk about what those proposed limits are in a moment. Revised lot standards to increase development potential. For example, there's a calculation called your floor area ratio. I won't get into the nuts and bolts of that, but if you certain numbers limit the amount of total development on a property, we said, look, let the site design dictate that density. That's gone. So you remove those sorts of restrictions and open up the property. Allow for some limited parking, and we'll talk about what those limits may be. With that, we coupled with improved parking standards and incentives. We'll talk about height, where you might allow single story along the road edge. You might allow buildings to set back if you're going to allow some parking up front. But we might type a building height ratio to that, and I'll explain that in a minute as well. We know that the economy, especially when it comes to residential housing, the comeback that we're seeing is not necessarily in single-family housing. While that's always welcome, apartments and higher density housing are really driving some of that growth. And so we want to allow for more residential housing because we think it can help support those businesses that are currently there and also ones that we would like to see in the future. And obviously, in keeping with the infrastructure investments that I've already made, is to allow for more pedestrian safety and amenities. We really want to maximize that pedestrian access and that rich, what they refer to as people places. You want to be able to go around and enjoy your community. And then ultimately, you want to make sure that you do provide and empower the planning board with the appropriate safeguards to make sure we are able to retain that vision for the Main Street corridor as well. And so the proposed zoning incorporates one way or another all these various changes. And I just want to go over some of the ones we're seeing here a little bit more specifically. In particular, with setback and building height. Currently, buildings are limited to a very strict setback standard, and if at that setback there's a minimum of 2-story building height. Well, we talked about how maybe that's not necessarily the issue. If your business plan would work as a single-story building, we want to allow that. And where we would allow that, as so long as it were right up along the road edge to make sure you're creating that pedestrian sphere with a single-story building. As you move further back, the height requirement increases. And so what we would look at is, say, at a minimum of 40-foot setback from the center line of Main Street, you would allow for a 15-foot tall building. As you move back to, say, 100 feet from the center line of Main Street, the minimum height for that building would then be 35 feet. And the ratio would move in a range anywhere from in there. And so the idea is you're creating, even if a building were to be set back, if that part of your business model works, that you could set the building back, it would still create a good pedestrian sphere. We know by design, as you push a building back and increase its height, you still feel that sense of enclosure from a Main Street pedestrian type building space. So what we're doing is providing options here. Another idea is to have a minimum build to lot width. The idea being that making a narrow building that runs the length of the site is not necessarily ideal. We want a strong front wall along that building. So we use here a 60% occupying amount of the building footprint. So if you're to measure lot width by facade width, at a minimum it has to occupy that 60%. Now, I talked about how there are smaller lots in the corridor. we include it in the zone that may not be able to occupy this or achieve this once you consider, say there's rear parking and you want to have access to that rear space, there would be waivers and accommodations for those types of buildings. So again, we're trying to allow for flexibility and recognizing there are many different lot configurations. And ultimately, when you put all these pieces together, you can look at, these are what we call a massing diagram. And you can imagine these being of various different buildings that would be in compliance with the proposed zoning. And what we used here are the smallest lots, by way of example. Obviously, the developability of a larger lot is easier to meet, but really we had to make sure that what we were proposing would fit on a smaller lot. So here we have examples of if your building's pushed back and is meeting those minimum height standards, and you want to put parking in the front, the standards are such that you would really have to ensure that you're meeting all the pedestrian connectivity, whether that be crosswalks, whether that be sidewalk elements, safe passage through your parking areas, visual screening. But certainly if you want to have a one-story building up to the front, that's allowed. And obviously what was originally envisioned is still allowed. If you want to have a multi-story building right up towards the minimum setback, that's certainly allowed as well. And I'd also like to add, and I don't have an example of this in my image, let's say you want to have a multi-story building pushed back, but you wanted to have outdoor seating, dining, a patio, a fountain, a plaza. You could certainly occupy that space in the front as well and have parking still on the side and the rear. We're not saying, hey, if your building goes back, that's where the parking has to go. In fact, we would encourage, the zoning currently as proposed, encourages to make that a pedestrian space and parking on the rear. The other big item that was added, I talked about more allowances for residential uses, allowing for, currently the zoning only allows for residential housing up above the first floor. 200 from the center line of the road to 250 foot back, we still think that's an appropriate standard to maintain, to have commercial on the ground floor and residential upstairs, or all commercial or professional office or whatever it may be. But once you get behind that 250 foot mark, the proposed zoning is encouraging not only those mix of uses, but residential uses as well. Here the zoning now has some preferred footprints or types of housing, whether it be higher density single family, whether it be townhouses or smaller apartment buildings. There are limitations in how wide, say for example, a parking or an apartment building could be. Couldn't necessarily be 500 feet of a large 3-story building. It would have to be broken up into smaller buildings, so we just don't have a massive apartment complex necessarily. But this was also done there to provide relief for some of the existing residents that are there. Currently, we know that they have to go through some zoning relief, whether that be area or use variance, if they want to do some modifications to their house. And the idea being is that, hey, we want to see those people stay there as long as they want to be able to stay there and make the investments in the houses that they have. But certainly, if there's an opportunity for those individuals, if they'd like to sell their land or a current developer owns that property, we want to make sure that they have the opportunity to maximize residential units in that area as well, so that we can have the shoppers and the office workers that can live, work, and play right into the proposed commercial area that is envisioned in the plan. So the outcomes from all of this, I think, are in keeping with when you go back, going full circle from our presentations, whether it's the Complete Streets presentation, Smart Growth America, the breakout sessions that we had during those. We want to make sure that we're in keeping with the comprehensive plan vision. And I think this does this, and I think for those of us who've been involved in the process agree. We want to make sure that we provide flexibility, recognizing that all the lots are not created the same, that the market isn't always conducive to making 2-story buildings everywhere right on the road edge, and that we need to be flexible from an economic standpoint. Increased development densities are good, and current zoning limits are actually counterproductive to the vision for the Main Street zoning. And then in keeping with the comprehensive plan vision, we want to make sure that what we are allowing to do, whether it be existing or proposed zoning, we want to make sure that we're maximizing those pedestrian connections, those opportunities for transit, if you would, and making sure we're creating a really attractive place to invest in, to live in, and to work in. And then, last but not least, maintaining those controls. Some of us may be in the position that you want to let anything in. I think having those safeguards at the planning board level will make sure that all in the community have a chance to be taking part in the planning process for anything that's proposed in the corridor, and making sure that that comprehensive plan vision is met. And so I think these proposed zoning revisions do just that.